Likely some are wondering why the video game got its own video. Honestly, it's for two reasons. One, it took a lot longer to play through the game because, as I've mentioned on many occasions, I am a filthy casual. And two, while the comic and the book essentially tell the same story from different perspectives, the game tells the story from a singular perspective, that of Dash Rendar. And given how egotistical the character is in-universe, I think he would appreciate the fact that he got a video all to himself. And of course, we'll begin with his origin and that of the game. By 1994, when Shadows of the Empire was first conceived, LucasArts was almost a decade old, and by this point had produced multiple Star Wars games, mostly platformers like Star Wars and Super Star Wars, and spaceflight simulators like Rebel Assault and X-Wing. However, LucasArts was beginning to branch out, and in 1995, the year that development of Shadows of the Empire the game began, was also the year that LucasArts released Dark Forces, Star Wars' first attempt at a shooter. I think this is noteworthy given that Shadows of the Empire has both shooter levels and flight sim levels, so it can be argued that Shadows of the Empire was in many ways a Frankenstein of Dark Forces and the more tried and tested flight sims like X-Wing. But the real wild card that LucasArts was hoping to take advantage of here was not format or gameplay, but rather of new advances in graphical technology. Shadows of the Empire was intended to be one of the first LucasArts games made specifically for the Nintendo 64. Video gaming was literally entering the 64-bit era. And so, Star Wars games, like video games in general, would soon say hail and farewell to sprites and hello to 3D models. A massive leap in graphical technology. But of course, this was still very early 3D graphics, with low polygon counts, and this affected the designs of both Dash Rendar and of Prince Xizor. Especially Dash, since Xizor only appears in a few cutscenes, while Dash is the player avatar. Although funnily enough, both characters were modeled using the same guy, Tom Kite, who posed in costume as references for Tim and Greg Hildebrandt, the guys who did the artwork for the Shadows of the Empire trading card game. The graphical limitations of the N64 also influenced the design of the Outrider, as well as that of ships in general in Shadows of the Empire. Since the N64 could only handle 4,000 polygons per frame, the developers had to reduce the polygon count of ships like the Snow Speeders or the Outrider itself to only 100 polygons in order to have more than one ship in every frame. Which is why, especially by today's standards, the ships in the flight sequences seem pretty low grade. Still, I will say this for the Outrider. Unlike a lot of other hero ships in Star Wars that are clearly meant to resemble the Millennium Falcon, I'm looking at you, Ebon Hawk, the Outrider has at least an in-universe reason for looking the way it does. Both it and the Falcon are based on ship designs made by the same company. So much for the game. Now concerning the character of Dash in-universe, most of which comes from a few offhand references in the Shadows of the Empire novel and from the source book for the Shadows of the Empire expansion of the old Star Wars RPG. Born around 29 BBY, Dash was the second son of a fairly successful family of shipping magnates from Karelia. While his elder brother Stanton was destined to lead Rentrans, the family business, Dash went off to the Imperial Academy on Carida, where he made a name for himself as an exceptional pilot. The future had seemed bright, but then his brother Stanton died in a terrible accident, losing control of the freighter he was piloting so that it crashed into Emperor Palpatine's personal museum of artifacts. Stanton died in the crash, but it didn't really matter, as in a fit of pique over this terrible accident, Palpatine made sure to punish the Rendar family harshly for the loss of so many of his little toys. The Rendar family was completely stripped of its wealth, Rentrans was given over to Xizor transport systems, and Dash was expelled from Carida Academy. Dash later learned afterwards that his brother's ship had been sabotaged on the orders of Prince Xizor, all because his parents had rejected an offer from Xizor Transport Systems to buy their business. Dash would harbor a grudge against both the Empire and Black Sun for the rest of his life, but apparently that grudge wasn't strong enough to make a rebel out of him. Instead, he seemed content to make his name as a freelance spacer, mostly operating out of the corporate sector, sometimes operating as a smuggler, sometimes a mercenary, sometimes a bounty hunter, sometimes an honest transporter, which of course brought him into contact with various figures on the shady edge of the law, such as Lando Calrissian and Han Solo. It was during this time that Dash eventually acquired his own ship, the Outrider, and his droid co-pilot, LEBO-2D9, or LEBO for short. And with that, Shadows of the Empire the game begins on the eve of the Battle of Hoth. The Outrider has just arrived with a shipment of blaster rifles, courtesy of Dash Rendar, voiced by John Saigon, Canderous Ordo himself, accompanied by his faithful droid co-pilot Lebo, voiced by Tom Kane, in his first ever voice acting role for Star Wars, though these days he's mostly known for voicing Yoda in the Clone Wars and Vandar Tokar in Knights of the Old Republic. And maybe it's just me or they're using the same filter, but whatever the reason, Lebo's voice reminds me of 343 Guilty Spark from Halo.
You'll pardon me for saying so, Captain, but it's been quite some time since you've flown an airspeeder in combat. If you're unwilling to help, I will simply find another. Still, I must have the index. Give your construct to me, or I will be forced to take it from you.
Like a lot of older video games, the story of Shadows of the Empire is pretty bare bones, and is roughly divided into 4 chapters, the first and last chapters being made up of 3 levels each, while the 2 middle chapters have 2 levels each. The story of Chapter 1 is pretty simple. Dash arrives with his shipment of blasters right around the time that the Empire shows up to attack Echo Base. He helps Rogue Group try to delay the Imperial forces long enough for the rebels to escape before making good his own departure from Hoth. I will give credit to John Saigon that his voice acting does give Dash a lot more character than, say, Kyle Katarn got in Dark Forces. One of my big issues with Katarn in that game is that he didn't really have any personality and just came off as a discount Han Solo. This being before Jedi Knight and Jedi Outcast gave him a character arc. But where Katarn came off as bland in Dark Forces, Saigon does give Dash personality, which is especially impressive given how little he has to work with. The best way to sum up Dash Rendar, especially if you look at the book and comic version, is that he's essentially New Hope Han Solo with the cockiness dialed up past 11. As for the levels themselves, while I'm sure at the time the Echo Base section, where you basically go third-person shooter mode, a first for the Star Wars franchise, was a big deal, for me, the really impressive parts, even considering how old this game is, are the 3D flight sequences. As anyone familiar with the original trilogy can tell you, the Battle of Hoth is one of the most iconic moments in the Star Wars franchise. Everyone knows that image of the AT-ATs coming over the ridge to open fire on the rebel trenches. I'm sure that if you were a gamer in the 90s, it must have been a mind-blowing experience to actually participate in the Battle of Hoth in a full 3D environment. Though of course I never did quite manage to figure out how to do the whole cable around the leg thing right, so I just resorted to flying by and shooting the AT-ATs over and over again until they finally collapsed. But for me at least, the real highlight of Chapter 1 is the space sequence. Yes, it is a rail shooter sequence, and so in terms of actual gameplay isn't all that different from the previous sprite-based space sims, but the 3D presentation really does make a world of difference. That sequence of flying up and over and past that Imperial Star Destroyer, watching it grow so vast as to fill the screen and then shrinking back into the distance. For the first time in the history of Star Wars gaming, players could really get the sense that they were in space, with all the size and scope that entails. Chapter 2 opens with a brief cutscene in which we are introduced to Prince Xizor and Guri discussing the plan to eliminate Luke Skywalker and thus humiliate Darth Vader. Xizor is voiced by Nick Tate, while Guri is voiced by Lisa Fuson, who also voices Princess Leia in this game, as well as many others. Tate's voice acting is okay, but this might just be personal preference. It seems to lack the kind of oily quality that I think Prince Xizor should have. Though I reiterate that might just be me. As for Fuson's take on Guri...
And no one will know that the new order to kill Skywalker came from you.
Do you work for the man, or are you trying to proposition him? The main thrust of Chapter 2 is Dash trying to track down Han Solo, and his best lead is IG-88. Presumably this is after the droid bounty hunter tried to waylay Fett on the way to Tatooine. Although Fett did escape him, Slave 1 was badly damaged, as was IG-88's own vessel, and so the bounty hunter droid has gone to ground on Ord Mantell to find equipment to repair his ship with. There really isn't much to say about Ord Mantell. You ride a train while taking out these magnetic things that will allow it to smash into this facility where IG-88 is hiding so that you can have a boss battle with him. It's not especially gripping, and given the low graphics of the time, the surroundings of Ord Mantell aren't exactly very interesting. It's a dingy junkyard. That said, this level design does remind me very much of the Corellia tram level from Jedi Academy, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if Shadows of the Empire was an influence on that. After besting IG-88, who is also voiced by Nick Tate, Dash learns that Fett has gone to the moon of Gaul to get Slave 1 repaired, which of course is the setting of Level 2 of Chapter 2. However, instead of flying to where Fett has Slave 1 and Han, like in the comic and the book, the Gaul level has Dash try to find Fett on foot. And while the introduction of the jump pack as a mechanic is pretty fun, this deviation really threw me. I mean, couldn't they have just done another rail shooter sequence like in the asteroid field? Maybe combine it with some of the fancy maneuvering of the swoop bike level that comes later? It's a moot point anyway, since Fett gets away regardless, although not without an obligatory boss battle. Level 1 of Chapter 3 is Dash trying to thwart the swoop bikers sent by Jabba to eliminate Luke, voiced by Bob Bergen. And again, I'm reminded of another level from Jedi Academy, in this case, Zanju 5. I will admit, blazing through Beggar's Canyon is pretty damn fun, even if I could barely go a few hundred meters without crashing the damn bike. And once again, I can easily imagine how much people back then would have been blown away by stuff like this. 3D graphics really was one of the great game changers, pun intended. Level 2 Chapter 3 is about getting the computer that contains the plans for the Death Star 2 and its location. Like in the book and the comic, it's concealed aboard a freighter. Unlike the book and the comic, instead of a space battle, which ends in disabling the ship and forcing its surrender, Dash has to infiltrate the freighter and obtain the computer directly. It's yet another example of the narrative consistency being subordinated to the idea of a fun gameplay experience, which I can perfectly understand. That is the entire point of a video game. That said, the interior of the freighter is probably the least interesting setting of all the levels. In fact, I'd bet my last buck that these are the same assets they used for the level design in Jedi Knight, which came out about a year or two later. At any rate, Dash has another boss battle, this time against an ornery loader droid, and obtains the computer. And so we enter Chapter 4. Prince Shizor has kidnapped Leia, and it's up to us to save her. First, you have to find the entrance to Shizor's palace via the sewers, then the palace itself where you have to destroy the connections between the palace and Shizor's skyhook, and one final space battle to complete the game. In true old-school game design fashion, the last part of Shadows of the Empire is the culmination of everything that has come before it, in terms of gameplay. Although I will say they kind of front-load it early on with the sewer level, as you not only run around and shoot, but you get to use the jetpack again. So there's a lot of creativity and maneuvering options. And of course, like all the principal third-person shooter levels, it concludes with a boss battle, this time against what appears to be the mother of all Dianogas. After that, the palace level itself is actually kind of a letdown. You don't really use the jump pack here, and it's the same dark, moody corridors over and over and over again. It really makes me wish that if someone were to ever redo this game, they could take advantage of the modern graphics tech that we have now and give the interior of Shizor's palace the kind of dark opulence that the leader of Black Sun calls for. A more interesting looking setting, I think, would compensate somewhat for the more standard gameplay of this level. But of course, the best is saved once more for last, and it is the space battle. And while the Outriders design is obviously pretty derivative of the Falcon, I will say that I like the design of the Virago and the other Black Sun fighters, especially given the graphical limitations and low polygon count the devs had to work with. It has this distinctly predatory look that's so clearly different from that of the TIE Fighter, the standard evil bad guy ship. At first, though, it feels like just a repeat of the last Hoth level, a rail shooter. The only difference is that you're shooting Black Sun ships instead of TIE fighters. But there's a reason the devs made this game to take advantage of the new 64-bit tech and 3D space of the N64. Because when you get to the Skyhook, instead of just shooting while Lebo flies like in the previous space level, you have to fly the ship yourself. The first true 3D flight sim experience in Star Wars history. Every single subsequent starfighter sim as recent as Squadrons can trace its origins in this sequence. Once again, with the Star Destroyer and the Skyhook itself, you get that incredible sense of scale that these are these humongous ships. And if the first level feels like it really is dropping you into the Battle of Hoth, the part where you go into the Skyhook itself to take out the reactor likely made players feel like they were going down the throat of the Death Star 2 in Return of the Jedi. Of course, it appears that Dash and the Outrider perish in the Skyhook's final destruction, but while Luke and the others mourn the loss of this brave ally, it's revealed that the Outrider jumped to hyperspace before the explosion. And Dash has no real intention of letting anybody know that he's still alive. 1. Black Sun will not remain leaderless for long, and whoever takes Shizor's place will certainly be gunning for him, unless they believe he's dead. And besides, this way he gets all the benefits of being a martyr without that pesky dying thing. And with that, Shadows of the Empire the game concludes. Overall, I'd say that the Shadows of the Empire multimedia event deserved the Canon verdict, but with an asterisk. And that's mostly because at several points the video game's storyline, such as it is, actively contradicts both the novel and the comic book. Treating Shadows of the Empire as one thing, which I think I must, I doubt I'm making much of a hot take in saying that the novel should be the primary story, with the comic as a supplement and the game as purely optional. And as a story, Shadows of the Empire is genuinely a good read. It's more plot-driven than character-driven. There are no serious arcs in the story. The plot has good pacing and moves smoothly from one event to the next. Although Dash Rendar is a decent character and has a good showing across all 3 versions of Shadows, the real showstopper, for me at least, is Shizor. Arguably, of all the characters, he gets more attention than anyone else, especially in the novel. The best way to summarize Shizor is like he is a less slimy Jabba the Hutt. And I mean less slimy only in the literal sense. He is arrogant, charismatic, loves to flaunt his wealth at every opportunity, is utterly ruthless and fiendishly clever. He has enough of that Xanatos magnificent bastard energy that you really do like to see him succeed, but he's also hateable enough that you like to see him fail, such as in his attempted seduction of Leia. His one mistake, really, was ordering Luke's destruction, thus giving Vader the perfect excuse to finally swat him for good. If he'd let Skywalker and his allies escape to hunt them down another day, he might have avoided his fate, as Vader would have only moved against him once he had conclusive proof. It really does make me wish that he'd been able to stick around longer. But I guess they can't all be Admiral Dalla. Even Thrawn didn't get a comeback after the conclusion of his story. And no, the barely sentient clone from Vision of the Future does not count. The first Star Wars underworld story, with the classic characters you know and love, and a great villain. For these alone, Shadows of the Empire is eminently recommended. He used to be called Citizen 625726. He used to call himself Unbroken. When he left his dystopian city behind, he thought he had found paradise. What he found was uglier and darker than anything he could have imagined. This is his story. This is Inferior. Now available in ebook, paperback, and audio form. Links in the description.